Welcome back to the show. My name is Matthew Lucci, and this is The Truth. Thank you very much for joining us once again on the American Liberty Media Network. Today, we're pulling back the curtain and telling you what's really going on in a lot of these elections. I learned a lot when I was running for Congress, and I've learned so much from a lot of the guests that we've had on already, and some of the guests we're going to continue to have moving here into the future. Now, one of the things that I really want to harp on for anyone who's interested in running for office, or anyone who really just wants to know what is going on behind the scenes, why we keep getting the same old rhinos elected into Congress, same old rhinos elected into state legislatures all across the country, and why the grassroots winning is the exception and not the rule. If you want to know why, here's what it is. It all comes down to power. It all comes down to those in power want to stay in power, and they will do everything within their power to make sure that that happens. Now, I'm talking about elected officials, but I'm also talking about key donors, key decision leaders, those behind closed doors who are really making the decisions in this country. I'm talking about folks in the financial sector who like the way that the deck is stacked. I am talking about folks who are in the tech industry and like the way that the deck is stacked. I am talking about those who are in lobbyist pockets who like the way that the deck is stacked. I'm talking about those who are lobbyists, who are government contractors, who are in the federal government. All of those people, they like the way the deck is stacked, and so they're going to continue to vote for the people that are in there right now because they know those people aren't disrupting anything. They're going to continue to fund folks exactly like that to take over mayor's races, to take over state house races, to take governor's mansions, to take the White House, to take Senate seats, to take congressional seats all across this country. It comes down to who has the power right now. They'll turn around and say, hey, I like things exactly the way they are right now because it benefits me. That's not working for the majority of us here in the United States of America. The problem that we have at the grassroots is we need to be better at organizing because we're up against a lot of money and a lot of power. And typically what happens when a seat comes open, like Texas's 12th Congressional District, which is anchored in Fort Worth and includes parts of Tarrant County and Parker County in North Texas, where we had the chairman of House Appropriations, a woman named Kay Granger, who's been in office for 28 years, when she decided that she was going to step down. That left a power vacuum there. Perfect recipe for a bunch of folks to flood in, just like in Michael Burgess's race in District 26, also in the great state of Texas. But the difference between that race in 26 and the race in 12 was there was a lot more planning that went into 12. Because 12 has been a establishment stronghold for a very long time. You have a woman who has held the seat for 28 years. It is very powerful in Washington, D.C. Before that was very powerful at the local level in Fort Worth, Texas. Left that open. Left a vacancy. But when you have power and the people who are pulling the strings to get you to vote a certain way, to get that congresswoman to vote a certain way for a very long time, and she was not conservative by any stretch of the imagination, even though she was Republican, those people wanted the same old. And that's what they got for the last 28 years. But eventually, that has to end. Now, their thought as the establishment is, who can we put into that position? Who can the establishment put in that position to keep exactly what they've been getting so far? And so, like what happens all across this country, the establishment will handpick a candidate to continue doing the same things that their last candidate, that their last office holder has done for a very long time. And ultimately what ends up happening all across this country is the big money comes in, the big endorsements from other establishment figures flood in. The media support, the PAC money, the lobbyists, they flood in because they know they found someone just like the last person who will carry on the same policies that the last person did. Even if they're coming out and they're campaigning for X, Y, and Z, and some of those are different from what the last person did, they know that if the establishment has handpicked, if they've selected, not elected, the next member of Congress, or the next mayor, or the next senator, if they've done that selection, if the establishment, politicians, party leaders, the folks behind closed doors, the folks with the big, deep pockets have decided that's the person, then those that also fall into that camp will fall in line. And if you've had plenty of time to choose who the successor is, then the establishment will clear the path for that person. They will make sure that there are no other former elected officials jumping into that race. There's only one guy or one girl who has the establishment backing. That's what they're looking for. They want that one person who is going to be really good at keeping things the status quo, because they know as soon as that person goes off to Washington, D.C., they are going to do absolutely nothing. Now, for those of us living here in the U.S., where it's getting harder to put gas in the tank, food on the table, and a roof over our heads, we want some change. We want things to get better. We want to be fighting back against inflation. We want some border security. We want job security. We want good, high-paying jobs so that we can earn a living to keep our families healthy and strong. However, the people that get elected to go off to Washington, D.C. because they have the most money for ads and the most money for signs and the blessing of all the other establishment figures, because they have all those connections, those folks, they're not in it for you and I. They're in it for their donors, and they're in it for themselves. And so when they go off to Washington, D.C., they're told, don't do anything. Don't mess this up. They're told, hey, look, if you step outside of what the establishment wants you to do, the establishment will run someone else to replace you. The establishment made them, and the establishment can destroy them as well. We've seen this in some places across the country when folks have decided they're going to rise up and say, hey, wait a second. There's stuff going on here that is not okay, and the American people deserve to know about it, one. And two, the American people deserve some change and someone to actually be fighting for them. The establishment doesn't like that because the establishment has the power. And the system that we have now worked for them. The system that we have now made them rich. The system that we have now gave them that power. They gamed the system that is right now, so they don't want to change the system. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. So, when they go off to Washington, D.C., absolutely nothing gets done, and we wonder why. We wonder why this Congress is the least effective Congress that this country has probably ever had. Now, you could agree that the government that governs best governs least, and so if they're not doing anything, at least they're not screwing anything up. Okay, great argument. However, things are getting screwed up right now, and we need to fix them. In fact, because Congress is not doing anything to get government out of our lives, is not doing anything to get out of the way of business, to get out of the way of you and I living our normal life and being able to provide for our families, they're allowing the federal government to get larger and larger every year. They're allowing larger and larger government agencies. They're allowing more and more encroachment upon our liberties. And this happens all across the country, and this happens every single election cycle, where we send folks off to Washington, D.C., and then they do absolutely nothing for us. Because the vast majority of those who win were basically anointed by the establishment. So we're going to be talking a little bit today with a good friend of mine, John O'Shea, who started a grassroots campaign in Congressional District 12, like we just mentioned. He actually jumped into the race before Kay Granger decided that she was not going to run for her 15th term. He led the grassroots. The hand-appointed successor for Kay Granger, Craig Goldman, was the only establishment figure to jump in because the establishment cleared everyone else out of the way. The two of those folks were also joined by three others, and ultimately it came down to those two making it into the runoff. That runoff is coming up pretty soon. We're going to talk about those dates. It's at the end of May, May 28th. You can vote early as well. We'll talk about all those dates later on in the show. But for now, let's have that conversation with John. Let's learn what John has to say, what's going on in his race, so you can get the sense of what's really going on in our country when we have folks trying to break in using the grassroots, using local, real people support, coming up against someone who has support of the establishment, who's been handpicked by the establishment. So without further ado, let's welcome John O'Shea. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be on with you, Matthew. I'm glad that you're decided to do this and enjoy being on.
Absolutely. Well, John, you and I know each other very well, but for those who are listening who don't really know who you are or want to learn more about you, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, what you're running for, and then a little bit about what really called you to run for this particular seat.
Sure. So my name is John O'Shea, and right now I'm in a primary runoff for the Texas's 12th Congressional District, better known as the seat that Kay Granger has held in Congress for the last 28 years. I'm from Fort Worth. I grew up here. My mom started the Oak Ridge School in Arlington, Texas. My father was chief of staff at Fort Worth Osteopathic Hospital. I went to TCU undergrad. I went to the University of Texas in Austin for grad school, and spent 20 years in the community as a community banker. In fact, I'd run a bank, started a bank, turned around a problem bank, and then the last 10 years had actually worked with some partners building a company that focused on construction and development around the Metroplex. We had sand and gravel quarries, we had concrete companies, actual construction firms, and candidly speaking, had never really aspired to run for public office. And such as yourself, somebody who bravely and valiantly threw their hat in the ring. But I felt a calling for it, and as I kind of like to describe, there were kind of two awakenings that I've had over the last 6 or 7 years. And the first one was one of the accomplishments of President Trump's first term was, and I do say first because he's going to win a third time and actually serve a second term. But one of the accomplishments that nobody really talks about was that he unmasked a system that this has been rigged against the average American citizen for far too long. And unfortunately, the Republican establishment's been in on it. And we saw that through Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and how they fought tooth and nail to push back on the America First agenda, which was what clearly had propelled President Trump into the White House and subsequently proved to be very effective in truly making America great again. So that was disheartening and really kind of led to me understanding for the first time that just because somebody has an R behind their name doesn't necessarily mean that they share our Christian conservative values, nor are they working for the betterment of this country. The second thing was during the COVID lockdowns, and we got to witness and I experienced firsthand the authoritarian nature of the people who are in charge, forgetting that they're servant leaders, that they actually work for us, that it's supposed to be God, the people, government, protecting our constitutional God-given rights, not threatening them and doling them out as they see fit. And as you've heard, because you and I've, kind of recounted each other's story several times, but, they shut down our businesses, told us we couldn't go to our places of worship, said our kids couldn't go to school, And things got even more egregious once the Biden administration took place, and they weaponized the government against us. They called people who marched through the People's Building, seemingly under the invitation of the Capitol Hill Police, insurrectionists, and hold them without any due process. They take people who pray the rosary outside an abortion clinic and do an up-armored FBI raid as if they're, tackling Osama bin Laden in front of the family for the shock and awe effect. And then, most personally for me, was the situation that my wife was disabled with a very rare form of brain cancer called medulloblastoma. And although she survived, she went, just truthfully, from being my partner to being my oldest dependent. And I, am her primary caregiver. And when things kind of got to her and trying to manage the family and raise the kids and maintain some kind of ability to pay for all that, I ultimately elected to put her in a small care facility with 6 rooms. And I was told by our Republican governor and a Republican county judge that I was not allowed to go out for our daily visit and take her out. And for those of you who deal with somebody who either is dealing with some kind of cognitive or dementia type issue, that personal visit and getting to leave the house, as nice as it might be, is something that they truly look forward to. And so when I was explaining to a woman with cognitive issues through a window screen that she wasn't being punished, but that, the government just thought that this was for her own well-being and that this too shall end and pass, something in me just snapped. And I said, how dare these people? This is not their place. This is not how God intended it. This is not what our founding fathers set for us. And I really started praying and reflecting upon it. And God does have a sense of humor. And so the response I got back was, well, if you're not going to consent and you don't want to comply, then you get up off the couch and go do something about this. So here I am.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, John, you are in a runoff with another gentleman who we can either talk about or keep him unnamed in this.
He who shall not be named. No, I don't mind naming Voldemort.
uh,
No, yeah. When I first came to this conclusion, and being a first-time, political candidate and seeking to serve in office for the first time, it was when Kay Granger was still in office and still planned to run again. And I know that because I asked her to lunch. And despite several attempts to make connection, we finally had a mutual friend who arranged the lunch. And I shared with her, I said, look, with all due respect, I appreciate your time and service. You and I wouldn't vote the same way, but I do appreciate that you've given your life and in public service first as mayor. And she actually was a fairly decent mayor for Fort Worth and accomplished a lot of good things for the community, even in her time in Congress. But I said, I feel a calling to run, and I just wanted to show you the proper respect. Well, nobody else was going to get in that race at that point in time because I was told by multiple people that I was crazy to think that an outside first-time candidate could unseat the 14-term incumbent, who happened to be the most powerful woman in DC as the chairwoman of appropriations. But I felt called to do it. And lo and behold, during the summer last year, she decided that she was going to bow out and not seek reelection. At that point, several other people threw their hats in the ring, most notably State Representative Craig Goldman. And as was recounted to me, Congresswoman Kay Granger was seeking a replacement for her when she had made that decision and ultimately settled on State Representative Goldman. She had actually approached a friend of mine and had said, would you consider running for my seat? And my friend said, no, but why wouldn't you just support John O'Shea? And Congresswoman Granger's response was, oh, I could never do that. He's way too conservative. So, um, it's now come down to 2 candidates. We proceeded through the primary. Nobody was able to get to 50%. This in spite of me being outspent about 30-1 and facing all the establishment endorsing State Representative Goldman. And as I like to characterize it now, this is America first versus the establishment, or as another congressional candidate told me the other day, this is Team Paxton versus Team Phelan. And I kind of chuckled, but I thought, that probably captures it for the voting public more readily, for people who aren't familiar with kind of how the establishment works behind the scenes.
yeah, absolutely. And For a lot of folks, especially those who are first time candidates, that's something that you obviously have run up against, figuring out the establishment likes to choose winners and losers.
Yep.
And they like to make sure that their power stays intact. So, what is it that has really made your campaign special to rise above the other handful of campaigns who did eventually jump into the District 12 race? What sets y'all apart from the rest of those, and what continues to set you apart from Craig Goldman and his campaign?
So, I guess from the very beginning, it's been my genuine desire just to serve, and I've approached this through an obedience to God and with trying to maintain complete humility in it. Obviously, I don't like the direction this country's going. The vast majority of people agree with me. And so once I had made the decision that this is what I was being called to do, I already started to put in the time and the work so that by the time that other people decided to jump in the race, I had already been a precinct chair in the Tarrant County Party for a number of years and had already gotten to know the precinct chairs. As you all know, the Republican Party is a ground up approach, not a top down like the Democrats. And the precinct chairs are the people who put in the work in the trenches. I had started already making overtures towards Parker County because our this district includes the western half of Tarrant and the top 2/3 of Parker. And I had gotten involved in grassroots organizations. I'd gone to meetings, I'd sponsored events. And so, the other three candidates realistically never had a fair shake because I'd already kind of tied that up. And the establishment was never going to go with any of the four of us. They always were going to back the establishment candidate. And of course, the way the establishment plays, as you said, it's a selection, not an election. So there was only one establishment candidate in this race. And in fact, not only did he tie up all of the establishment money, but he also had a PAC out of Vegas that was funded by Never Trump Ken Griffin that weighed in heavily in the race and spent a couple $1 million not only promoting State Representative Goldman, but also spent more money personally attacking me than I spent on the entire campaign. So um, that was kind of what differentiated us. We had the grassroots support. They already had seen me fighting in the trenches with them. They understood that this wasn't some pretext to political career or some personal ambition, because they saw the genuineness in my heart. But as it goes forward, it's pretty easy to draw the dichotomy now. Even without having to go into State Representative Goldman's voting record, which clearly tells a tale of three Craig Goldmans. But the fact is that um, you know at the end of the day, he has either been in public office or been a lobbyist almost all of his life. And in fact, his brother is a lobbyist. And if you look at the clients that his brother represents, like Google and the Chinese Communist Party controlled drone company DJI, it kind of tells a tale in and of itself. And so, he actually is part of the host committee for Speaker Dade Phelan, soon to be ex-Speaker of the Texas House, in Dallas next week. And not only is that potentially a conflict and a violation of FEC law, but just the fact that he supports publicly Dade Phelan when there is such a vitriolic grassroots response and a desire to unseat him and kind of overturn the establishment machinations down in Austin, I think speaks volumes. And it's part of the reason why he would not get up and debate me and has not shared a stage with me at any opportunity he could avoid it.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed particularly in your campaign is just this dichotomy between folks who are grassroots and folks who are establishment. One of those issues in which you differ is that of election integrity. That's been
Right.
something that folks have been talking about across the country, and especially here in Texas. Talk to me about your plans for securing our elections and where you differ from the opposition on this issue.
Well, first and foremost, and not many people view it as a situation of election integrity, but I favor term limits. I think that that's at the root of things, kind of a problem. Our founding fathers never envisioned us, trading the yoke of the King of England to the yoke of a ruling class of professional politicians. And in fact, State Representative Goldman did have an opportunity to vote on term limits down in Austin, and he voted in opposition to them. The other thing I would say is that, and it's not something that I've delved into in great detail. I believe that our elections are interfered with, that there is numerous channels of cheating that occur and have gone out publicly and said that I think the 2020 election was stolen. I don't believe I've ever heard State Representative Goldman speak about that one way or the other. He tends to avoid controversial topics and just vote present when he can and dodge the issue. But he has not actually been for much in the way of votes down in Austin that would maintain election integrity. A number of my supporters are actually leading advocates of it, and so I kind of defer to them. But it's the simple things that we know. We need chain of custody on the votes. We need voter ID and make sure that people are valid, registered U.S. citizens to vote. In fact, that was something that he surprisingly had an opportunity to vote on. There was a constitutional amendment that was on the legislative calendar last session that said, controversial for a Republican, I know, you must be a U.S. citizen to vote in Texas elections. We know the Democrats are trying to replace us as voters. We see municipalities and states where they're trying to give illegal aliens the right to vote. They don't get the right to vote. That's not their right. It passed the Senate 29-1, meaning every Democrat but one voted to support that. So they even understood the common sense and the kind of constitutionality of that. It got to the House, and being a proposed constitutional amendment, it required a 2/3 vote. Well, the Texas House being 150 members, it would have needed 100 votes. State Representative Goldman voted with the Democrats and voted present. He couldn't even take a stand on that position. So, I don't know where he stands on paper ballots versus machines or, issues such as that. But if he can't even agree on the most fundamental right that you must be a U.S. citizen to have the privilege to be able to vote and actually the obligation and responsibility, then I think we're probably going to be pretty, light years apart on that whole issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to dive into one more topic briefly. You just got back from a trip at the southern border.
Yep.
Obviously, border security has been a huge issue across this country and especially here in the great state of Texas. What did you see on your trip? What did you learn? And what should voters know before they go to the polls here at the end of May?
Well, so one of the things that State Representative Goldman is like to tout on the campaign trail is that, the Texas legislative session was one of the most conservative ever, and they did such an amazing job picking up the slack of the federal government and securing our borders. And, look at this remarkable spending bills that they passed. And actually, first of all, with regard to him, that misses the point wildly on a couple of issues. First of all, they had 3 years to address the problem and didn't. And in fact, they prioritized impeaching our beloved attorney general, which is a Democrat priority. It was never a Republican issue, over securing our borders. They didn't pass it in the general session. They didn't pass border security in the first two special sessions, even though it was a stated objective of our Governor Abbott and the Republican Party. It wasn't until the third special session that they passed two bills, and notice it was SB3 and SB4, meaning they were Senate bills, even though they worked to kill similar legislation that had been proposed in the House. So again, despite his proclaimed accomplishments, I would suggest that he has been willfully underprepared in this area. What I personally learned is that what we are hearing being touted by our own state government as far as what we're accomplishing in stemming this tide of illegal aliens breaching our border and wresting control back from the cartel is being completely mischaracterized. In fact, I visited with law enforcement officers. I visited with the district attorney of Kinney County. I visited with the deputies and sheriff of Kinney County. I was in Eagle Pass. In fact, I went down to Shelby Park, which is kind of the landmark, piece. Hey, look, we took, Shelby Park back from the Department of Homeland Security being used as a processing center. Now we fortified it, and it's going to be our anchor military base to secure our border. And what I found were a few cargo containers, some barbed wire, and a golf course. And in fact, we had gotten permission to go down and tour with the National Guard members who are manning it, and then only to find out that Governor Abbott found out who was coming with us and revoked our ability to do so. What I also find is that there's a lack of cohesion, that most of the efforts are seemingly performative. In fact, we visited with several ranking members in the National Guard, and just what we heard was a travesty. In fact, once Operation Lone Star was begun, that there never was a command objective stated. That for all they know, there is no official statement of purpose. And so, in addition to it, you've got the Texas military reporting up through the DPS. So you've got law enforcement leading a military engagement, and there's really no stated rules of engagement. So depending upon the sectors that you're dealing with, you may have one. And for example, the policy expert who kind of arranged our visits and the places that we, the ranchers that we got to contact and the state party members and so forth, he actually had been part of the Department of Homeland Security, and he talked about one of the sectors he had previously served, and they actually took their responsibility very seriously and were really trying to enforce control. Unfortunately, in that whole sector, the Rio Grande Valley, which is Eagle Pass and Del Rio and Kinney County, that they've not been given any clear objective, and apparently their area commander has just seen fit to kind of tell people to stand on top of those cargo containers and shout down at people and try and verbally chase them off. In fact, even that buoy barricade that they built in the river that was supposedly going to be so effective at stopping the flow, it's so ineffective that they showed me pictures of kids and coyotes sitting on top of it and playing on it and taunting the National Guardsmen, and that the barbed wire that they set up along the coast is being breached on a routine basis. In fact, they call off the patrol boats at 5 o'clock in the evening, and then the coyotes come over on their boats and openly in front of the National Guardmen just start clipping the wire. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's seemingly largely performative to get numbers. Even when they do capture people, unless we get a court to rule in favor of this new SB4, they just turn around and hand them to Customs and Border Patrol, and all they do is process and release them back into the area, into the country. So it's a lot of show and little to show for it, unfortunately. And the people there are very discouraged, and they feel like not only are they being neglected, but they're being betrayed and abandoned by their governments, both state and federal.
Yeah. And that's why we need to get great people in there, great America First candidates at all levels, from city councils all the way up to Congress and in the White House again.
Yep.
Um, Speaking on your race, very briefly, what do you need in order to succeed? How can listeners help you, and where can they find out more about you?
Sure. So first of all, I honestly have seen God's hand in this race, and we've overcome insurmountable odds being and money being thrown at us, against us, not at us. And so prayers first and foremost. Secondly, I would encourage people to go to my website. It's OSHEA, the number 4texas.org. So that's OSHEA 4texas.org. If you like the platform, you want to support an America First candidate, consider volunteering. Please spread the link to friends and family. If you're able to do so, any kind of contribution would be appreciated. We've been largely grassroots funded and self-funded. I've put my own money in this. The money I've put in, and it's been over $100,000, and it's not a loan to the campaign, which is typical. I've made it as a straight contribution, meaning that's money spent. I'm never getting that money back, but I'm not asking my volunteers or supporters to do anything that I wouldn't personally do myself. And we are absolutely not taking any PAC or special interest money. Well, if there were the right conservative PAC that didn't have any strings attached, we would consider. But to date, we've not accepted, and we will not accept any lobbyist money whatsoever. I'm going to be accountable strictly to the voters in Texas's 12th Congressional District, and don't even want the appearance of there being any conflict of interest.
Well, wonderful, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to hop on this podcast. We'll get this shared to as many people as we possibly can. We obviously wish
I
you the best of
appreciate
luck.
that. Hey, one last thing. In fact, I'd be remiss if I didn't say. So the primary runoff election date is early voting May 20th through the 24th, if you are so inclined to early vote. And the actual election date vote itself is May 28th. Primary runoffs typically have low voter turnout. And so every vote's going to count on this one. So you've got a very clear choice here. It's America versus Rhino. And if you think it's important, and if you feel like I do that our country's hanging by the thread, then if I could please implore you to get out and vote and make your voice heard, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Appreciate your time.
All right. God bless.
I want to extend a huge thank you to John for coming on the show and taking time out of his very busy campaign schedule. The runoffs are coming up, like John said, May 28th of this year. You could early vote May 20th through 24th. I believe that there's around 30 or so, 32 races across the state of Texas at the state and federal level where no candidate got at least 50% in the primary election on March 5th. So, as John was talking about, and as we talked about before the interview, there's really this battle between the establishment and the grassroots that's happening all over the country. And we see it in state house races. We see it in federal races. We saw this back in 2016 when Donald Trump was running for president. His whole approach was anti-establishment. And the vast majority of the folks on those debate stages on the Republican Party were establishment figures who thought that it was their time, that it was their turn. And we even see this, this time around. We saw this also in 2020 when Joe Biden was running, and there were a handful of others also running. Whether it was Cory Booker, whether it was Bernie Sanders, etc. Ultimately, the establishment had picked their candidate. In 2016, the establishment behind closed doors had decided that Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee for the Democrats. In 2020, they decided that Joe Biden was going to be the nominee for the Democrats. Doesn't matter what the initial polls said. They would push and they would push and they would push for their person. The person that they knew would be an establishment puppet and only do what the establishment wanted them to do. In this case, it is continue to stack the deck for those who have the money and those who have the power. We see that here in this race with John. It is a battle between the folks who have the power and have the money and those of us who have the vote. Now, ultimately, what it takes to win is great organization. The grassroots cannot win every single race the way that we're doing it right now. It's not feasible. But if we build up grassroots around the country and focus on key districts, key races, we can take back seat by seat this entire country. That's what we need to be focusing on as the grassroots. That's what we need to be focusing on as America First conservatives. Figure out, how do we organize our neighborhood? Figure out, beyond that, how do we organize our city? Beyond that, how do we organize our local towns that surround the city? How do we organize our county? A lot of this work happens within the state party and the county party. But a lot of this work can also be done by private groups that you and I can start, and we work hand in hand with the local party. We work hand in hand with other organizations that share our values. But we need to make sure that when we're working hand in hand with folks, that they are actually sharing our values. The party as a whole, whether it's national, state, or local, but particularly national and state, they choose winners and losers. And ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of who gets chosen as the winner or loser in an election, usually we, the people, are the losers. And those who have the money and the power because the system worked for them, those folks get to be the winners all the time. That's why we need to organize. That's why we, as conservatives, need to do a better job of getting folks together, planning out how we're going to be taking back our local seats, our state seats, and our national seats, and then executing on it. When we do that, we can win elections. When we do that, we can force the establishment into runoffs and ultimately knock them out. Because elections in politics should never be about who has the most money, should never be about who has the most power. It should be about we the people, what we decide. If voters are educated, and that's a key issue. If voters are educated, they're going to do what is in their best interest and what is in the best interest of this country. But we need to make sure that we are organizing so that we can get out there and educate voters. Plan and execute that plan. That's what it takes to challenge the establishment. That's what we got to do. So I hope that through this, we have peeled back the curtain a little bit to just show in every single circumstance across this country, there's an establishment push for that seat. We cannot let the establishment have things without a fight. Sure, they can outspend, but the grassroots can always outwork. We just have to organize that work. We have a lot of work to do, and I'll let you get to it. Thank you very much once again for joining us on this episode of The Truth with Matthew Lucci. My name is Matthew Lucci. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.